10 years after first issuing them, the White House has updated what's known as uniform guidance on grants and federal assistance. One reason for the update, reducing regulatory burden on agencies and grantees. Here with a review of the highlights, Haynes Boone procurement attorney Dan Ramish. And Dan, the uniform guidance is a little bit outside of FAR and contracting concerns, but yet something you felt is important to highlight here.
Yes, Tom. So the federal government spends more than $1 trillion a year in grants and other federal financial assistance. So it's a really important tool, and it's important to taxpayers. And government contractors will sometimes participate in the federal grant space, either as contractors or as recipients or subrecipients. So there's a lot of money, and increasingly the federal grant and assistance space is becoming subject to more requirements that start to look like government contracts. But this latest change in the uniform guidance is really intended to make things easier on awarding agencies and recipients and subrecipients.
So what are some of the big changes people can expect? I mean, this has been like a rulemaking, even though it's not a rule per se, but there has been commentary and drafts and final versions, fair to say?
Yes. So the uniform guidance forms the basis for agency grant and federal financial assistance regulations. So even though it's not a regulation itself, different agencies adopt it with a little bit of their own flavor. So the big things in this rulemaking, it was mostly changes in the margins. And there are some changes that are intended to improve access and the ability of recipients and subrecipients to participate. So one of those changes is there's a new template for the standard solicitation and notice of funding opportunity. And that's in Appendix 1 of the uniform guidance. And there are some new guidelines contained in that appendix that tell federal awarding agencies to pull out their strunk and white. They're supposed to reduce word count and use plain language, leave out provisions that aren't strictly necessary, and even include an executive summary, 500 words, that tells applicants the goals and objectives of the program, the target audience, and eligibility requirements.
Sure, and there are also some updated thresholds for what gets audited, what gets investigated by the government, and also for some of the provisions for equipment and ancillary costs associated with a grant. What are some of the top ones there? Let's talk about maybe the threshold for what gets audited.
Yes. So the Single Audit Act requires audits for state and local governments and nonprofit organizations under federal grants and assistance. And that threshold hasn't been increased in many years. And now the updated guidance will raise that from $750,000 to $1 million in total expenditures of federal funds for a single fiscal year. So that's directly intended to make it easier for recipients that aren't receiving that high a volume of awards to not have to be subject to an audit.
So for an agency that's giving awards, then if it gives a lot of them that are under $1 million, then its own burden is relieved if it doesn't have to audit every one of them.
That's right. I mean, the auditing agency may be different from the awarding agency, but it's certainly the burden on the auditors could also be reduced. And, focusing on where the risk is, and certainly the order of magnitude is part of that risk analysis.
Sure. Another big one is the de minimis rate adjustment. Tell us about that.
Sure. So the de minimis rate is a default indirect cost rate that the uniform guidance allows for recipients to use instead of negotiating an indirect cost rate. And the benefit to recipients there is that there's no documentation requirement to justify the rate. And that rate also hasn't been adjusted for many years, and it's a pretty low indirect rate of 10%. And the updated guidance will increase that rate to 15%. And it also makes a related increase. So there's a limit on the amount of subaward funds that count as part of the modified total direct cost. So the de minimis rate is applied against a base that is the modified total direct cost of the award. And one of the adjustments is subawards over a certain value are excluded. And the result there is, of course, that recipients aren't receiving as much of their indirect cost recovery as they otherwise would. And so that rate is also increasing from $25,000 to $50,000. So it'll help recipients that use the de minimis rate to recover more of their actual indirect costs.
We're speaking with Haynes Boone procurement attorney Dan Ramish. So that's the equivalent, well, the analog of when you look at a charity and what percent of the money actually goes to the charities and what percent is overhead. That's kind of what the de minimis is all about.
Yeah, it's covering administrative and general expenses that aren't directly tied to the award. But those are real costs that the recipients have to bear, and it's fair for them to get compensated for them. And particularly for newer recipients or subrecipients, it's more burdensome to have to go through the indirect rate negotiations with an agency. So this is a good option for many of them.
A couple of the provisions I wanted to make sure we covered. There are new whistleblower protections and new requirements for reasonable cybersecurity internal controls. That seems to be like maple syrup covering everything the government is eating these days. But let's talk about whistleblower protections in the context of grants.
Well, so whistleblower protections have been a focus across the government, including, of course, in government contracts. And this is directly related to concerns about controls over waste, fraud, and abuse, and ensuring that there are mechanisms to prevent that and to promote enforcement. And so there's now a specific whistleblower protection that prevents recipients or subrecipients from reprisals against whistleblowers that report waste, fraud, and abuse, and also requires them to notify employees of the whistleblower rights and protections.
All right, and that's kind of making it a little bit more uniform with how whistleblowers are, in theory, protected elsewhere in other types of activities.
Yes, I would say that's one of the ways in which they're aligning things with government contracts.
And then new requirements for reasonable cybersecurity internal controls, also kind of in alignment with what they're asking contractors for in various ways across the government.
That's right. Clearly, cybersecurity has been a big priority for the administration. And I would say, though, that this requirement is pretty generic. They opted against imposing some of the more detailed rules that the Department of Defense has applied to government contracts. But it's a movement in that direction and reflects kind of the priority for the government in this area.
And one more I wanted to ask you about, and that is the equipment threshold, because sometimes grants might be for laboratory work or for developing some kind of a new technology test and so forth. So there's a hardware, if you will, piece to the grant and not just brain power.
Yes, so there's a threshold for what constitutes equipment under the uniform guidance as well, and that is another threshold that is increasing to reduce the burden from $5,000 to $10,000. And the reason that's important is that there are special requirements for managing equipment. And so if an item that is purchased under an award doesn't constitute equipment, that reduces the burden.
All right. Anything else we need to know? And so agencies need to, I guess, get this into their grant-making apparatus and inculcate these guidances.
Yes. So there will be relief in a number of ways, as we said, with the thresholds, with efforts to make notices of funding opportunity more plain language and easily understood by prospective recipients. So the effectiveness date is established as October 1st, 2024. Agencies also have the discretion to implement the new guidance earlier, but it has to be no earlier than June 21st, 2024. And so agencies will be coming up with their own plans in the coming weeks to roll out their implementation of the final guidance. So recipients and subrecipients should be tracking that. May 15th is the date for the new guidance. So We'll see how this plays out.
Not much time left. Haynes Boone procurement attorney Dan Ramish. As always, thanks so much.
Thanks, Tom.
And we'll post this interview along with a link to the new guidance at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.